Hello and welcome to Season 2 of Stuck in the Mud, the podcast. In this season, I'm opening up some of the bigger themes from my book, Stuck in the Mud, Stories of Hope for When You're Stuck. If you're interested in the book, it is on general release. What I say to people is, look for the yellow boots. Now, in this season, I'm interviewing a bunch of different people in a way that I hope you'll find interesting. What we've done is chosen a theme, prepared 4 questions each for each other, and then taken it in turns to open up the conversation to see where we go. I hope that you enjoy all of these conversations, and I really hope to see you soon. So welcome to this installment of the Stuck in the Mud podcast. And today I've got a good, actually kind of an old friend who we've kind of pit stopped through the years together doing various different things. This is my friend, Tim Alford, and he has got a new book out called Leadership 101, which we're going to be talking about today. But for those of you who don't know who Tim is, Tim, why don't you introduce yourself and the context of this thing for the people listening and watching?
Yeah, sure. Well, hey, John, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. Pleasure to be with you. So I'm Tim, and I live in Malvern. If you haven't heard of Malvern, I don't blame you. But it's near Worcester. And I'm married to Jen. We've got 2 kids, Tobiah and Aria. And my job, or vocation, I guess, is as the National Director of Limitless, which is the youth and children's ministry of Elim Pentecostal churches across the UK, though we serve youth and kids workers and groups and churches, cross-denominationally through our events and training and so on and so forth. And the inspiration for writing the book, John, there were a few things I wanted to achieve with it, really. Firstly, I noticed that there was, lots of great leadership stuff, Christian leadership stuff.
Yeah.
And then lots of stuff that spoke to the practice of youth and children's ministry, but very few things that spoke to the leadership of the youth or children's worker. Yeah. And so it felt like there was a space there which would be helpful to try and fill a little bit. So I wanted to speak into that space. But secondly, I wanted to try and provide something of a book that you can read, from beginning to the end, cover to cover, but also something that would serve as a little bit of a leadership field guide or a handbook or a manual, something that you could return to as you are presented with different leadership challenges and opportunities in your ministry as you go along. And so that's why I wrote it in these like short, quick fire chapters. Yeah. So it was easy to reference, easy to access those different bits. I've got to have a challenging conversation with somebody in my team. What's the best way to approach that? Easy to jump into the book and find that, reflect on it, and equip yourself with the tools you need to have that conversation, and so on and so forth. Because I don't know about you, but I often find myself, I'm preparing a talk, or I've got something coming up specifically around leadership I need to engage with, and I go, I read something great about that in that book. Yeah, where was that? And then I find myself trying to wade through 250 pages, and it's a bit like a needle in a haystack. So I wanted to write it in a way that it was engaging and fluid and congruent cover to cover. Yeah, but you can also come back to it and refer to it as a bit of a manual as you go along as well. So that was part, I guess, the motivation for writing Leadership 101.
That's fantastic. And I think one thing that's really funny is like, I get the impression, now I'm not sure whether we are the same age. I get the impression you might be a bit younger than me, but when I was reading, and just for the sake of the people watching this in the future, I've got a third of the way through the book already, and it's split up into 3 sections, which I really like. And one of the things that really struck me while I was reading this, and Tim, this is very much about your book, but I just released a book myself. And what's really funny is...
I've got right here. Hello.
Oh, there it is, Stuck in the Mud. What's really funny is that when I got to the end of that first section, I had this moment where I was like, as a leader, we're similar ages, we're leading people, lots of different people who are, kind of in youth ministry and young people. I got to this point in your book where I thought, if I was a bit cleverer, I might have been able to write this, but my reflections in my book as a leader speaking to other leaders on the ground, I found that we're touching on so many similar themes, and I
Mm.
thought, man, I've kind of written my book Stuck in the Mud as a storyteller, and I
Yeah.
tell stories, and then there's reflections. But you've done such a beautiful job of unpacking the individual aspects that I was hoping to also kind of weave into the narrative of my book Stuck in the Mud. But when I got to the end of that first section, I thought, man, we're talking about some similar themes here, and it really it really encouraged me that we were kind of finding some similar things.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
is really where my kind of questions are framed. One of the first things I wanted to talk to you about was your section about rhythms and
Mm.
particularly about retreat rhythms. Um,
Yes.
and I wanted to ask you about that because I found it a real challenge, because earlier on this year I went on a bit of a retreat and had a moment where I felt that God spoke to me about something which I've actually been struggling to put into place in my sort of everyday life. But you talk early on in the book about a moment where you felt God was calling you to a particular way of working, and 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 you've been successful at that. You've actually been able to implement that. And I thought, it'd be great to ask you about that and the impact that these rhythms have on us when we're kind of going through our leadership journey.
Yeah. Yes. So important, John. So I know the stories which you're referring, and I'll come to that in a moment. But in terms of the rhythm piece, I write about finding a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly rhythm
Yeah.
of to pause, reflect, and to innovate. Um, I am not wise enough or gifted enough to lead out of my own strength or giftedness or capacity or experience.
Mm.
I need to keep in step with the Holy Spirit. I need to know what the Lord is asking me to do. I need to come to Him for envisioning and wisdom and
Mm.
strengthening. And I think that is true for all of us. That's true for every leader. And actually, I think when we forsake that time of um, being in God's presence, listening to Him, bringing what we're doing before Him, I think there are a few dangers that are associated with that. One is that we carry on doing what we've always done just because we've already done it,
Mm.
um, not necessarily because it's what God is doing now.
Mm.
But what if some of the things that we're doing now that God was once in and that God once asked us to do, He's since moved on from, but we were too busy to stop and listen and notice. And so we're still carrying on doing those things because they worked before, but God's asking us to do something new. We're not listening.
Yeah.
So I think that's a danger. I think what happens is that our ministries begin to plateau when we don't take that time to stop and to listen to God, because again, we're not in step with the Spirit. We're not keeping on God's agenda. We're just getting from one day to the next. But also personally, I think we can lose passion, energy, vision. We find ourselves starting to become tired, cynical, burnt out.
Mm.
I need the resource of the Holy Spirit in my life. I can't do it. So my principle in my life every day is that I'll spend time with God alone before I spend any time with my phone. That's
Yeah.
my rule. So every morning, and it is a spiritual discipline, and it's one I couldn't live without. Just a little time in the presence of God, in the Scripture, in prayer, just in silence, actually sitting and enjoying the presence of God. I try to do a weekly day of prayer and fasting. Funnily enough, that's actually today. And so, just literally before recording this podcast, I took a walk out of my office up onto the hill here with my journal in hand, and I just sat with God on a bench, which has become a bit of a holy place for me, a bit of a sacred space.
Yeah.
I just spent a little bit of time with God, where I usually be eating there. Monthly, and funnily enough, it's tomorrow. I try to take a full day out to pray, but also that's a strategic moment as well.
Mm.
So, we all get caught up, don't we, in the whirlwind of just getting from one day to the next, from one week to the next. We've got program to organize, we've got events to get over the line, we've
Yeah.
got talks and sessions to write, and it kind of can become relentless. And so one day a month, I want to stop and I want to think big picture,
Yeah.
and I want to think long-term strategy. So it's prayer, but it's also strategic future casting as well.
Yeah.
And some of the biggest dreams and visions and God ideas have come out of those spaces.
Mm.
And then once every year, I'll do that same thing, but I'll do an overnight. I'll do it for 2 days. And I found that that's a rhythm that's really worked for me. So, I'm sharing that not to say to people watching, listening, do that, though I think you couldn't go too far wrong.
Yeah.
But to encourage you to intentionally plan, prioritize, and protect. They say that about marriage, don't they?
Yeah.
But with your time with God as well, plan, prioritize, and protect those times to stop, be in the presence of God, dream, think big picture. Yeah. So the story that you mentioned, John, is one where it was one of those 2-day
Yeah.
annual retreats that I do either right towards the end or right towards the start of the year, to reflect on what's been and think ahead. And the Lord spoke to me about 3 things. The 3 ways, I guess, in which He's gifted we, and which I add the most value to the ministry that I lead to
Yeah.
live with us. And those 3 things were leadership development,
Mm-hmm.
vision and strategy, and kind of public communication. So whether that's preaching or preparing to preach, or writing or podcasting or
Yeah.
whatever it is, that kind of representation of the ministry piece. And the Lord instructed me to work to give 80% of my working time to those 3 things.
Yeah.
And then, the remaining 20% to those kind of whirlwind activities,
Yeah. Yeah.
inbox and, administration and events organization and all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
So the way I sought to do that was kind of visually to take my Google Calendar, which I open every day, and to this is only going to appeal to a certain kind of person, but it certainly helped me to color code those 3 activities,
Nice.
those 3 types of activities in my diary. So if it's vision and strategy, it's blue. If it's public communication, it's purple. If it's leadership development, it's green.
Yeah.
And what that means, John, is rather than that just being like a good idea that I had or something that God spoke to me about, and it's kind of aspirational. Literally every day when I open up my diary, I can see instantly
Yeah.
if I'm giving about 80% time or more of my time or more or less to the things God's asked me to give it to. And I know if I am getting out of that rhythm, it means I can go, wow, I've not really done that this week. I need to try and adjust my schedule a little bit. I need to try and bring it back. So it's just a practical and visible way to help me, I guess, execute on the instruction that the Lord gave me that time.
Yeah. And if any of my team are watching or listening to this, then they probably would have thought just then about how we have a system of kind of pie charts and color coding so that we can actually look at a visual representation about how everyone's time is being spent and make adjustments. And I love that actually doing that in your Google Calendar, I think, is really interesting. I don't do that in my calendar, but I do that with my kind of sort of timesheets things that we do as a team. But that's really fantastic. And I think that those kind of rhythms, it's so essential that we have those rhythms, really, whether we're I don't know, like leading a big organization like you, or kind of working down the local shop, actually hearing from God and finding those personal rhythms of leadership are applicable for absolutely every single person, in every walk of life, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, and I'm fortunate enough to be employed full time in a ministry role, so there are certain privileges that affords me.
Yeah.
But the majority of those things, certainly that principle of spending time sitting in the Lord's presence, first thing we do every day. I'm a dad of two young kids. I've got a busy job like everyone else, but I'm still able to do that. Certainly that principle of a rhythm of prayer and fasting. I'm sure even, the busiest person is afforded a half an hour lunch break, where on a day they could go out of their office, they could take, or wherever it is, they could take a little walk, they could just spend a few moments in prayer. Jesus said when you fast, and not if you fast. So these kind of rhythms, they won't come to us. We have to go after them. They don't appear by default. We have to craft and create the time to experience them. But for anyone in leadership, particularly in Christian ministry, how can we lead if we're not being led by the Spirit of God? I don't know another way.
So, no. Another area that you picked up on early in the book, I found a joy and so helpful and quite unique. And that is the time that you spend, and it was only a small section, but it was poignant. You talked about exercise, and exercise is close to my heart, and rhythms of exercise is close to my heart. But I noticed that, particularly in the youth work world, that we work, morning, noon, and night. Every youth event's pizza, every breakfast's bacon, every every lunch club's donuts, and I find sometimes that over the years I look back at myself and I go, actually, the kind of almost the youth work cultural kind of lifestyle is almost inherently unhealthy. And I love the fact that you spent a moment talking about fitness. I don't know whether you have any kind of big revelations about this, but I think that kind of movement, regular movement, is it's as much kind of it's much an expression of holiness of anything else. But I think it was really interesting to hear that you make a point of it in the first really couple of chapters of the book. Why was it important to you to add even that small section, to add something about the rhythm of movement in self-leadership?
Yeah, it's a great question, John. And I think the reason we can undervalue looking after our bodies is because we detach what is physical from what is spiritual.
Yeah.
But that's not biblical theology.
Mm.
Biblical theology is deeply embodied. In fact, our future hope isn't like a disembodied, ethereal, floaty spirit. It's a resurrection body.
Yeah.
Our future hope isn't a floaty, cloudy heaven. It's a new creation.
Yeah.
It's a physical, material world where the heavens and earth are joined together as one. And we make a mistake when we detach what we do with our bodies from our spirituality and from our discipleship. Yeah. So Romans chapter 12, what does it say? Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice.
Yeah.
Why? Because this is your true and proper worship. So according to Scripture, our true and proper worship isn't about the songs we sing on a Sunday morning. It's about what we do with our bodies. What we do with our bodies is our true and proper worship. And so things like having a consistent and regular rhythm of sleep, a consistent and regular rhythm of exercise, a healthy diet, putting good things into our bodies. These things are deeply spiritual pursuits.
Yeah.
And they are part of our discipleship, and not just our discipleship, but our worship of God. Not to mention the benefits that are associated with sleeping well, eating well, and exercising well. Actually, we increase our capacity as leaders. We increase our energy as leaders.
Yeah.
when we have those healthy rhythms
Yeah.
built into our lives. And so please don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying that everybody needs to be an athlete.
No.
That's not what I'm suggesting here. I'm not saying everybody needs to be a marathon runner or, but I do think it's incumbent upon us to be good stewards of the bodies that God gave us
Mm.
through the way we sleep, through the way we eat, through the way we move and exercise. And actually, those things will make us better leaders. Because not to mention, I haven't even started to touch on the mental health benefits
Yeah.
of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And if we're struggling with our mental health, one of the most positive things you can do to impact your mental well-being is have a regular pattern of exercise, being outside in nature, eating well and sleeping well. These things are huge, and they are deeply spiritual.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, as I say, I love that, and I was so encouraged to read that in the first part of your book,
Yeah,
that those rhythms are important, and as I say, I think often in kind of youth work, we sometimes get out of those rhythms, particularly good eating, like you're talking about,
yeah, yeah,
sleep, the mental health stuff, is crucial, and in some ways, and you said this a second ago. It's not that we want an end result of being, kind of a pumped up athlete, but getting the discipline right for the glory of Jesus,
yeah,
and discipline in all areas of our lives.
yeah,
You talk a bit about the social media. You talk
yeah,
about Netflix, and how many hours we while away without even realizing it. You lose them, you never get them back. But all of these rhythms, I think, are absolutely wonderful. So yeah, thank you so much.
What are your rhythms, John? Because you said that movement being something that you think about that's important to you. But how have you made that work as a youth worker with all
Yeah,
of those challenges of sometimes unsociable hours that we do in
yeah.
youth ministry, etc., with family as well? How have you made those rhythms work in your life?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm similar to you. I've got three kids, and the organization that I lead over a few different communities, sort of locally, and I got to a bit of an impasse. It was 2014, and I had struggled, and I'd struggled from probably 2009. Um, Really finding it quite difficult to get into good rhythms of the organization I was leading in the Southwest. That ended quite abruptly. Unfortunately, I was made redundant, and the move to this area in Shropshire, um, it felt like good news, but everything along the way got very close. The difference between coping and not coping was very close.
Right,
And
right.
by the time we got to 2014, and I was 17 stone. I wasn't eating particularly well. I was struggling to um, I was struggling to figure out why things weren't working. Do you know what I mean? Like it was,
Yeah, yeah,
but actually what I discovered is that actually some of the past difficulties, some of the past hurts had meant that I'd just kind of gone into a bit of a kind of crisis mode with eating and with exercise. So all I was really succeeding at was doing my job well. Do you know what I mean? Like, I
yeah,
felt like I was being a dad all right, and I was being a husband pretty well, I think. But the only thing that I was really succeeding at was doing my job,
yeah.
and I got to a point where my health, the doctor was a bit worried. Everything kind of
Mhm,
was
mhm, mhm.
spiraling, and I hadn't at that point made the connection between the kind of the like the physical and the spiritual, if you like. You talked about that a minute ago. I hadn't really
Mhm,
made that connection before. I hadn't.
mhm,
I don't think that I'd really considered that. but needed a massive change, and found that weirdly enough, finding consistent movement, it basically it kind of started to deal with everything else quite naturally. So my prayer discipline became quite linked with my movement discipline. So getting up early in the morning became exercise and prayer, and then prayer and exercise, and that turned into a much kind of healthier lifestyle. What it did in my relationship with Jesus was interesting, because I found that both of those things were quite connected. And then over the years, I mean, I'm a little bit bigger now than I was when I first lost the weight, but I'm a lot stronger. But actually, that discipline, I find that if one goes, the other goes. They're almost the same these days.
Yeah.
And that's been a real challenge.
Yeah, totally. And you've used the word discipline there several times in what you've just been saying. It reminded me of Hebrews 12:11. No discipline seems enjoyable at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And that is true of exercise. It's true of eating well. It's true of getting up early in the morning to spend time with Jesus. It's true of fasting. It's true of all of these things. They may not feel natural or enjoyable at the time, but you so feel the benefit of it when you build these things as consistent disciplines into your life. That you absolutely no doubt about it. I was going to say never a truer word spoken then, but it's in the Bible. So
that's right. So let me ask you about something else, because again, in the first section of your book, I'll just keep showing it. There you go. It's really lovely. In the first section of the book, you refer a number of times to the 7 habits, to Stephen Covey. And again, I just was like, yes, mate, because I've been a student of the 7 habits for a long time as well. And I wanted to ask you, because I think everyone that knows the 7 habits material has got a favorite habit or favorite story that surrounds the habits. So I'll give you my example, and then we'll see whether you've got one. So my example is the green and clean that Stephen Covey tells the story about. He asks his son to look after the front lawn. He says, look at the neighbor's.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So he says, look at the neighbor's lawn. It's green and clean. And I want you to look after our lawn, and the aim is for it to be green and clean. And so he says, this is yours now, son. This is yours to do. And the son agrees, and they have a pact. And it's like, you're going to do this. He's like, yeah, I'm going to do it. And a couple of weeks go by, and the kid's done nothing. And so he goes to the son and he says, you haven't been living up to this. Remember, it's green and clean. That's what we're going for. And it just goes on and on and on. And then the penny drop moment is that he realizes that the pact with his son has got to be to walk alongside him to make that lawn green and clean together. And that kind of responsibility is not just handed over, but it's walked. And that stayed with me for years and years and years. And I always come back to that. And I thought, you referred to 7 habits so many times that you must have a favorite habit or a favorite story in it that you remember.
Well, particularly in that first section of the book that you read, because as you say, it's 3 sections, and the first section is the self-leadership section, and then there's culture and team building, and vision and strategy is the other 2 sections. And because of the nature of 7 habits of highly effective people, it was a really useful source for that self-leadership section. And probably my favorite, it's not a story, it's an illustration actually, that comes to mind as you asked me from 7 habits. And I think it might be one that I refer to in the book, is the idea of sharpen the saw.
Yeah.
So he talks about, like, imagine that you're cutting down a tree.
Yeah.
and you've got a saw, and you're trying to cut down this tree with a saw, and you're moving it to and fro, to and fro, to and fro, and you hate to stop because it feels like progress is ceasing, but actually taking the time to stop and to sharpen the saw will actually make that work more effective in the long run.
Yeah.
I love that as a principle, and actually it refers back to the first question you asked me, John, and the principles of those rhythms of stopping to pause, reflect, and innovate. That is the sharpen the saw stuff. It may feel like, oh, I can't do that because I'm so busy and I've got to cut down the tree.
Yeah.
But actually, when we do build those rhythms in, we're sharpening that saw so that the work is more productive, more efficient in the long run. So I love that illustration of sharpness.
That's great. And if I can say one thing I really enjoyed, Tim, is that in the 7 habits, sharpen the saw is the last thing you find out. What I love about your book is it's the very first thing you talk about. And one thing I really value, I don't know whether this will make sense to everybody who's listening, but one of the things I teach my team when they're teaching, particularly when they're teaching, is to not act like a cheap magician. You know, the big reveal should be the first thing you say. And I say to my team all around, you know, when you teach, when you preach, it shouldn't feel like you're revving up to a big ta-da. You know, the ta-da moment of, you know, I've said lots of things now, and now I'm going to hang it together with this. You know, I love the idea of putting front and center the most important thing and saying, okay, guys, this is the most important thing, and it's going to be the most important thing now and at the end. And I love the way, I don't know whether you did it on purpose, but I love the way you actually started the book with, look, guys, we're going to have to sharpen the saw. That brought me a lot of joy. And it brought me a lot of joy to start your book and go, yes, this is good.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you should say that, actually, because obviously sharpen the saw. That's the kind of preface, if you like. But then in the first chapter, I talk about the 10 most important things a leader should do every week, and the first one is spend that time with Jesus every day, like we were just talking about. But then the last chapter is about keeping in step with the Spirit and how we stay, you know, aligned with what the Spirit of God is doing. So in that way, you know, different perspectives, but on that same thing, it's actually, you know, leadership is actually about us being led by God, by the Spirit of God, and you know, creating the space for that to happen. So yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah. It's a total wraparound. I love that. I have a bunch of other questions, but I kind of feel like maybe one of the most relevant things now to ask you is, one of the things that what has kind of brought you the greatest enjoyment and satisfaction in your leadership journey? Maybe this is a way for us to kind of come into land and wrap things up. But yeah, what's brought you the greatest satisfaction and joy in your leadership journey, mate?
It's a great question. And the reason I'm hesitating is because I think there are 2 things that I take a huge amount of joy from.
Yeah.
First is every time I see a young person or a person respond to the gospel for the first time and to make a commitment to Jesus and decide to follow Jesus for the first time. And, you know, especially when I get to hear, especially when a youth pastor feeds back to me, you know, a story like, hey, you know, Sarah, she made a first time commitment to Jesus at Limitless Festival, and she's getting baptized today, and she was sharing in her testimony about what God did in her life. And, you know, that kind of stuff just brings me huge joy, because especially the event side of things takes a massive amount of work.
Yeah.
And those stories are the reason why we do it, and it makes all that effort and work worthwhile. So yeah, one is all those stories of you know, people giving their lives to Jesus for the first time and getting to play a little part in that. but the other is I love spending time with leaders. I love investing in leaders. And so I guess one specific example of, and I do write about this in the book, um, would be when we started our youth group here in Malvern, Limbus, Malvern. Um, we had at the time, 18-year-old on the team with us. And cutting a long story short, she took on more and more responsibility over a few years. And then I handed the leadership over to her and served on her team. And that moment of, standing at the front of the church with the elders, laying hands on her, praying over her, commissioning her to go lead, and knowing that I had had a little part to play in her leadership journey and helping to release her into her potential and to everything that God has in her life. That was a great moment, that brought me a lot of joy. And I think that's, maybe it is a nice way to finish, because that's what leadership is, isn't it? Leadership is not about rallying people around you to help you succeed. It's about releasing others into their God-given potential. That's ultimately what Christian leadership looks like, and that's what great youth ministry looks like. So yeah.
Mate, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I really do want to recommend this. Your book has for me, over the last sort of few days, when I read this first section, it switched me on in so many ways. Some of it a real encouragement, some of it, as I said at the beginning, that made me go, oh, that's so similar to things that I wrote. I've done loads of like marking up on pages to go, I need to come back to that. And I'm really excited to read the rest of it. And if you're listening to this, watching this, and you think this all sounds really interesting, you can get this pretty much anywhere.
All the usual places.
Usual places. It's very, very good. And I do want to recommend that. Tim, I hope that all the promotion's been going well, and you've probably had lots of this sort of stuff.
Bits and pieces of Zooms and podcasts and interviews and all of those kinds of things. It's one of those things where it's been like a real passion project for me. I just got such a heart for those people, some of whom would describe themselves as youth or children's workers, some of whom have just put up their hands to fill a gap, but who are giving something of themselves to pass on the gospel to the next generation. Because sometimes that's really hard going, and often it's undervalued. And I just really wanted to do something that would help. And so more than anything, I just hope it gets into the hands of the right people who are leading young people, who are leading kids, and it helps them. It helps them to succeed in what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly, when I finish mine, I'm certainly going to be passing it on to somebody, and I've already planned to buy a couple more to give to team members if they haven't already got that. So, mate, thank you so much, and let's catch up again soon. Thank you, all of you, for listening and watching, if you've been watching this on YouTube or Facebook, and really hope to see you all and Tim very, very soon. So thank you very much.